You're listening to live coverage from the 2023 Southwest Beef Symposium in Lubbock. We're at the Overton Hotel and getting close to the end of today's first day. Whole day tomorrow as well. Well, half day tomorrow starting at 8, wrapping up at 11:30. Two-day Southwest Beef Symposium continues live here on the farm station. All ag, all.
Thank you. Well, when you opened this morning, you were pretty correct when you said it's kind of a land grab, except it really is a land grab. It's pretty major. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and visit with you guys. I was able to do this program last year. Bruce invited me in last year to the one that was in Tucumcari. So I don't know how many of you were at that program. Were there quite a few of you or not? Looks like not very many. That's good, because I think I'm going to go a little bit, give you a pretty good background on what 30 by 30 is, but I really want to move into how it's being implemented, because I think that's really what's going to impact all of you before we get done here today. So I want to give you a little background. We are a property rights organization, and we got started, well, I'll give you a little of my personal story. I was raised on a ranch in Nevada. Our operation ran over 1,100 square miles. If you know anything about Nevada, you know that if you're raising a cow, it's going to be on government land at some point. Nevada is 87% federally owned. Very different from Texas. So when you're running an operation in Nevada, the federal government is one of your business partners. And I would highly recommend doing everything you can to keep the government out of your business. When we moved to that ranch, I was 10 years old, and we had problems from day one on the operation. My dad had had operations that had Forest Service leases before and had no problems getting along with the agencies. But on this particular ranch, in this situation, they were after our water. We owned all the water on the grazing lands that we operated on, and the Forest Service came in and filed over every one of our water rights and then used their regulatory power to run us out of business. We were 27 years in court fighting that. And I can go through a number of stories with you to kind of lay the groundwork to give you a better sense of what all that entailed. But let me just summarize by saying that we learned the hard way how important property rights are. And when I married my husband and moved to Texas, which was about 20 years ago, and had the opportunity to live in a part of the country where the people own the land, believe me, it's different. Life is much different, and life is much better when we own the property and we can decide how our operations are going to be managed. You know, one of the reasons that we do what we do, we protect property rights and the liberties they secure, because property rights and liberty, our individual liberty, goes together. You can't have one without the other. It takes our ability to own the land to protect our individual liberties. Now, when we think about our founding, America's founding, we think about what makes us different from other countries. Well, we have separation of powers. That was brilliant. We have the Bill of Rights. A lot of other countries don't have that. But those are pieces of paper. What is it that gives the people the ability to defend those rights, to ensure those rights? It's our ability to own the land. That is what is so unique about America, is the power was put in the hands of the people through our ability to own the land. Think about when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase. It doubled the size of our country when he did that at that time. He didn't get on the phone and call Bill Gates or China and say, how much of this land do you want? It was opened up to settlement. The people could go out, and depending on which state you settled in, you could claim 120 acres to 640 acres and create your homestead. That's what built the middle class in America. See, our founders understood that if we were going to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people had to own the land. That was critical. That's why when our nation was founded, the federal government was not to own any land at all. Those resources were to be held by the people. Well, when we moved to settle in the West, as you all know, that changed. Half of the West, 50% of the West, is owned by the federal government. Today in America, government owns close to 40% of the land in our nation. Only 60% is held by the people. And when you understand how important it is that we own the land so that we can protect our individual liberties, that begins to get a little frightening. Our organization, American Stewards of Liberty, let me see, we're going to try a new clicker. We'll see if I have any better luck. No, not any luck. It is, yes, definitely. There we go. So our organization, you can go ahead and advance one more. We're based here in Texas, and we live in Georgetown, Texas, so very close, which actually I normally say is too close to Austin, if any of you guys know what Austin is turning into. Yes, we have young students for sure that know. But we do a number of things. We educate, we work on issues like this and educate the public on issues like 30 by 30. We organize, we try to organize the alliances between different groups to work on these issues. We held a summit in Lincoln, Nebraska, hosted by Governor Ricketts last spring, which Kim and Ty both attended, and that was fantastic. We had a great group of people. And we activate the people. So as we come upon issues that you people need to get involved in to help us stop either good things or bad things that are going on, we activate. Next slide. You can go ahead and advance. So, what is 30 by 30? 30 by 30 is an international agenda to permanently protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. This means lands with no human use. This is not lands where we can graze cattle or mine or even recreate. These are lands that are to be set aside for nature, for species. The philosophy behind this is that man degrades the environment and that we are losing tons of species, and therefore we must remove man from parts of the land so that nature can survive. The organization that, next slide please, the organization that really promotes this in America, that really launched this in America, is an organization named the Center for American Progress. Now, the Center for American Progress is a socialist progressive organization. You can go to their website and you can learn all about them. Their purpose is to implement socialist policies in America. And 30 by 30 is one of their key agendas that they're pushing. Now this agenda, so in America, when I mentioned this is an international agenda, it's being pushed on every nation. What's going on in the Netherlands, if you watch what's going on there, is a part of kind of a precursor of 30 by 30, what we can be experiencing here. The Center for American Progress is really the entity that was, that kind of took the lead in America to basically figure out how do we implement this project, this program in America in a nation where the people own the land. There's a particular problem here. The people have property rights, which is not the same in other countries. So this report, How Much Nature Should America Keep, is what they produced. It's kind of the playbook to telegraph to policymakers and environmental groups how we get this implemented in America. And so it's good to take a look at what is their basis for this. Why are they interested in pursuing this program in America? Next slide. So here is their rationale. This is what they think. This is why we must protect 30% of our land. They say in the coming decades, over 1 million species will go extinct. Now, what is this based on? This is based on the climate crisis science. Climate crisis science is based on models. It's not based on data. And if anybody believes they can predict what nature is going to do in the coming decades, they're fools. We all know that. You're in agriculture. You know how it changes every day. We just listened to a presentation about weather, which was a lot of predictions of what we think might happen in the next weeks, months, years. Try to extrapolate that out and come to some kind of a conclusion 50 years from now that we're going to lose over 1 million species. That's what they're doing. That's what all the science is based on, are models. They say we're losing a football field worth of habitat every 30 seconds in America. Now that sounds pretty scary. It's meant to scare you. They say 2/3 of the development that is occurring on private lands, only 1% of those lands are permanently protected. So 2/3 of all the development that is occurring in America is occurring on private lands, the land you own. But only 1% of those lands are permanently protected. And they say that in America, only 12% of the total lands is permanently protected in its natural state, according to the definition that they hold to for 30 by 30. Next slide. Now, we started really learning about 30 by 30 when President Biden was elected, because we knew that the environmentalists would be running the agenda that we would be fighting, the environmental agenda. So we started studying what they were doing and learned a lot about 30 by 30 at that time. We knew it was going to be a part of the Biden administration's agenda. And one of the things when we were doing our research that we found was that in the Trump administration, there was a resolution filed in the House and the Senate that promoted this idea, the 30 by 30 concept. Now, only 15 members from across both bodies had signed on to this resolution. So first, it's a resolution. It wasn't an act of Congress. A resolution usually means it's somebody's idea that they want to start floating, but there's really not a lot of support for it. There wasn't a lot of support for this, only 15 members. Next slide. But it's who signed on to these that had us most concerned. In the Senate, it was then Senator Harris, now our Vice President. And in the House, it was Deb Haaland, who is now Secretary of the Interior. And at the time, next slide, at the time that we found this, Secretary Haaland, Representative Haaland then, her name was being floated as our Secretary for the Department of Interior, which was very concerning. Because not only does the Department of Interior manage most of the lands that is owned by the federal government, that department has a lot of regulatory power over private lands. It oversees the Endangered Species Act. So that had us very concerned. And when we found this, we knew that we were going to be facing this agenda. Now, it was implemented January 27th, 2021, in an executive order signed, it's the Climate Crisis Executive Order. It's a 57-page executive order, signed 6 days after President Biden took office. Next slide. Most people missed it. Number one, they weren't looking for 30 by 30. We were, so we did catch it. And there's only 2 paragraphs devoted to this in this executive order. And if you didn't know what 30 by 30 was, you would think, well, it's really not that, you'd probably gloss over this. But what it says is he's putting forward the agenda to achieve the goal of conserving at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. So when we read it in this executive order, we knew exactly what it was, but even we needed confirmation. Next slide. That same day, the Department of Interior issued a fact sheet on what the Department of Interior would be doing to implement this climate crisis executive order. including specifically what they would be doing for 30 by 30. And if you'll notice, what it says in this report is that we're losing a football field worth of habitat every 30 seconds. We're going to lose a ton of species, including 1/3 of all species in America, if we don't do this. And that currently today, the problem is only 12% of the lands in America are permanently protected. So this is cut and paste out of that CAP report, the Center for American Progress report that we looked at first. And this all told us that was the agenda that they were implementing. Next slide. Let's start walking through some of the numbers, because one of the first questions that people have when they start learning about 30 by 30 is what lands qualify? What are they after? So here's what the 12% is. They gave us the figure 12%. That comes from the USGS gap analysis. So we have a hard number of what that is. What makes up those lands are the national parks, the wilderness areas, permanent conservation easements on private lands, state parks, national wildlife refuges, national monuments, and other protected areas. And let me just say something about conservation easements. If you're a landowner and you've ever considered a conservation easement and you've been told that that remains private property when you put a conservation easement on your land, this should tell you the government thinks differently. They know they have permanent control of that land. And control is the most fundamental element of private property. When you put a conservation easement on your land, you no longer have control of that land. It's no longer private property. Next slide. And here's the definition of what qualifies for permanently conserved, what qualifies for the 30 by 30 program in the CAP report. According to the currently accepted international and domestic standards, for an area of land or ocean to be counted as protected, it must be permanently protected in a natural condition, and extractive uses must be limited or prohibited. It's lands that we don't get to use. Next slide. So here's where our protected areas are currently in America. This is the USGS gap analysis. Now what they've done is they have a database and they've taken all the land acreage in America and categorized it into 4 levels of protection. Level 1 and level 2 are the highest protected, the most restricted areas. And that's what makes up our 12%. They're the 2 dark green colors on that map. So you'll see most of it's in the west. You'll notice Yellowstone National Park. You can pick out some of the parks. But these are the most restricted areas in America. That's our 12%. The light gray areas, that's largely our private land. That's why Texas is pretty much white and gray, which is nice. The light green areas are other lands owned by the government, but they're just not as restricted. So there may be grazing on it, mining, other productive uses. Next slide. The National Geographic is one of the environmental groups that has been pushing this agenda worldwide. And in 2019, they published this article in the US version of their publication and did a nice piece on why we must permanently protect 30% of the lands in America. And so they produced this map. And this shows to scale what it looks like. If you put all the 12% lands together in one block, that's the small block. If we put the 30% together, what they're trying to achieve, that's the big block. That's a lot of land. Probably the one who I think explains this the best is Governor Ricketts of Nebraska. I should say former Governor Ricketts of Nebraska, now Senator Ricketts for Nebraska. He said, this is the equivalent of permanently protecting one state in Nebraska every year for the next 9 years, or 2 states of Texas. Next slide. All right, let's start doing the math. Remember they've said we're losing a football field worth of habitat every 30 seconds in America. That's designed to scare the uninformed. What does this work out to? Next slide. It's 3,000 acres a day, 1.1 million acres a year, 11 million acres in 10 years. Okay, so if we do their math, this is the problem that they have defined, that the crisis is we are potentially losing 11 million acres from natural areas to developed areas over 11 years. So the question becomes, what is 30% of the nation? It's approximately 700 million acres. 12% is already permanently protected, which is 300 million. So what they're trying to achieve in the next 9 years is adding another 400 million acres. When the problem, as they have defined it, is at best 11 million acres. They say this program is about conservation. This program is not about conservation. This program is about control. You know, you want to know what the real numbers are? Current developed areas in America, 5.3%. 5.3% of America's land is considered developed. This came out last March in a report published by the Heritage Foundation, written by Rob Gordon, and he crunched the numbers and did the math. Half of that 5.3% is considered open space. In other words, it's the golf courses, it's the city parks, it's open drainage areas. So what we're really talking about when we talk about land that has our homes, our schools, our businesses, our churches, our grocery stores, we're talking about 2.5% of America's land if you put it all together. We are not in a development crisis. Next slide. Actually, we're going to have to roll through all these. Keep going. And one more, please. All right. Key for Texans to understand, and people from New Mexico as well, is private land a target? Absolutely. Remember they said 2/3 of all development is occurring on private land, but only 1% of the private land is currently permanently protected. This program is largely about getting control of the private property. And they say in this report, the United States will not reach a 30 by 30 goal unless policymakers do more to help farmers, ranchers, fishermen, and other private landowners conserve lands, waters, and wildlife. This is the key language to understand. This is the propaganda. This is how they've decided to sell this to landowners. They are here to help you. They are here with conservation programs, conservation easements, all kinds of great things to tie to your land, which creates a federal nexus and eventually allows them to restrict and control in ways that you can't even foresee today. Next slide. Another good piece of good news for you all, because I know this is really exciting, fun news. 30% is not the end game for this group. What they are really pursuing is an agenda called the Half-Earth Agenda, where they believe 50% of the land must be permanently protected in order to save humanity. In the CAP report, their last goal is, they say, in fact, if the United States achieves 30 by 30, the country will be well positioned to pursue a longer-term goal of conserving half of all of its lands and waters. Next slide. We're already seeing this play out. New Mexico's governor signed an executive order to implement 30 by 30 in New Mexico in 2021, in August. Not only does it direct the conservation of 30% of the lands, but she includes an additional 20% for climate stabilization areas. She's at 50%. Next slide. The state of Vermont did something very similar. Their bill, they passed a bill by both houses, the Senate and the House, with the goal to reach 50% by 2050. Fortunately, there was a Republican governor that when this got to his desk, he vetoed this bill. But it was passed by both houses. Probably shouldn't be too big of a surprise. Y'all probably remember who their senator is, Senator Bernie Sanders. So it's not a big surprise that this came out of Vermont. But the point being, this is their agenda, and they are getting it implemented in our country. Next slide. So one of the key questions we always ask is, so there's a lot of agendas out there. The environmentalists have come up with a lot of pretty wacky things that we look at and we think there's no way that could even happen. But one of the things we look at is, do they have the people in place to get this implemented? And we've already talked about some of the key people in the Biden administration, which is why this even came up. But what about some of the other, what about the nuts and bolts, the people who actually are behind the scenes getting this done? Do we have to be concerned about that? Next slide. The author of this report, while he was at CAP, his name is Matt Lee Ashley. Next slide. And Matt Lee Ashley currently serves as Chief of Staff for the Chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality, which is co-chairman of the 30 by 30 task force. So the one who wrote the playbook for this agenda in America is sitting in one of the most critical staffing positions to get this done. Next slide. And when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed last year, and a lot of additional conservation funds, money was given to conservation funds, Biden replaced the National Climate Task Force Director, and he put in John Podesta. John Podesta is the founder of the Center for American Progress. When he was appointed to this, one of the news articles that came out said he should be able to hit the ground running because, of course, first off, he already knows the inside of the government because he was Chief of Staff for President Obama. And second, so many people from the CAP organization are already populated throughout the Biden administration. They can get things put in place pretty quickly. Next slide. All right, so now let's take a breath. That's a lot of how this all came about, who's in place to make sure this is getting implemented. And I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing to fight this, because we've actually had some phenomenal success in slowing this program down. So the program was initiated January 27th, 2021 by executive order. And let me point out something that I don't think I've said quite yet. This was done by executive order. There is no congressional or constitutional authority for this program. It's being done by presidential fiat. It's unauthorized. So how he's been going about getting this implemented is using existing programs and retooling them to get to this end. So they initiated it. Next slide. Immediately, 3 weeks later, we had our first resolution to oppose 30 by 30 passed by Garfield County, Colorado. And then we started distributing that around the country. Remember I said that one of the things that we do is we activate. Well, those people who are on our list who get our material, we sent all of this out to them. And immediately we started getting resolutions passed all across the country to oppose this. That was critical because at that time, we were very concerned we were going to be facing a 30 by 30 bill. If you remember, they had the House, the Senate, the presidency, and a lot of crazy stuff was going through that administration and Congress. So we needed to get the word out that the people opposed this very quickly. And those resolutions sounded that alarm. We also were able to sit down with Governor Ricketts in Nebraska And he's one of the sharpest individuals I think I've ever really visited with. But he immediately got on board and sent a letter to his colleagues, the other governors, and got 15 governors to oppose 30 by 30 and send a letter to the president. And we had a 30 by 30 Termination Act filed in the House and the Senate by May. We had an incredible ground game that happened because of people like you. And I know we've got Kim and Ty in the audience, and they were involved in all of this. Next slide. Currently, we have about 160 local governments, counties that have opposed 30 by 30 officially, and that's just the ones that we know about. So how did the administration respond? The press had labeled it a land grab, understandably, by then, and they were set to come out with their report to explain to us, in the executive order, President Biden gave them 90 days to come up with a report to explain how this was going to be implemented in America. So they came out with their report, and we were all thinking, okay, they're going to tell us what land they're after, what's the definition of conservation, what is this going to look like? Well, they did a pivot and conceal. The first thing they did, they changed the name of the program. You're no longer supposed to call it 30 by 30. Now you call it America the Beautiful. You know what that's designed to do? It's designed to get the uninformed public to buy into this program. Then they also say they don't define or identify which lands are going to qualify. They're going to be doing an atlas to help catalog all that. So they deflect that question. Then they also say, many times in this report, that this program is not about protecting the land. It's about conserving and restoring the land. So they were trying to counter our narrative. So they say it's only about conserving and restoring the land. They're just here to help working landowners do more with their land. But then they say, but conservation means different things to a lot of different people. So it's really too hard to define. So they don't define conservation in their own report. They're hiding the ball. Next slide. But that was pretty critical because that was a critical moment in the campaign because they had to pivot and come at this from a different direction. A lot of which has kind of gone underground, but there's still a lot that we track. All right. So let's talk, that's a pretty good background on what 30 by 30 is. Let's talk about how it's being implemented today. I mentioned earlier it's unauthorized, so it's not like they have a bill or a law that they follow that says this is how we're going to implement 30 by 30. What they've had to do is use existing programs to get to their 30%. Next slide. So they're using existing laws to restrict the use of the land. Next. They're funding federal land acquisitions. They receive Congress permanently has funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which permanently funds $900 million a year, which is to go out for, half of which is to go out for land acquisitions. They don't need to be buying any more land, but Congress has given them a lot of money to do just that. They're encouraging the enrollment in the conservation programs. The conservation programs are key to implementing 30 by 30. And they're granting funds to NGOs to acquire the conservation easements in perpetuity. The Department of Interior has awarded or appropriated $1 billion to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which then takes that money, regrants it to states and to NGOs, land trusts primarily, to implement the 30 by 30 agenda. There's a lot of money that they have put into this that's flowing, and they are doing everything they can to get landowners to sign up for these programs. Next slide. So let me jump a little bit over into what's going on in the West. In the West, they've released a campaign, the environmentalists have, called Rewilding the American West. Now remember, in the West, they already own half the land. This program is designed to create, what they're planning to do is create 11 districts, about 5,000 kilometers each district on the federal lands, and you can see the different colors on that map. Those are the different districts. And then to connect those together using the federal land acquisitions, buying private property, and putting conservation easements on private lands. The objective is to create corridors from Canada to Mexico, a contiguous corridor, for the wolf, to introduce the wolf into these areas, and the beaver. Now, why those two species? The wolf covers a lot of land, the beaver takes the water. The rationale is that if you protect the environment of those two species, you're also protecting the environment for a lot of other species. Now, as this plan goes into place, there's 3 things that have to be eliminated in these areas. First is livestock grazing. Second is mining. Third is the off-road vehicles. So whenever you see that they are going to lock up an area and you can't use motorized vehicles in that area, that means recreation is getting cut. Because how many people can walk into the backcountry, shoot a deer, and pack that thing out 10 miles without having a vehicle? They eliminate recreation. The recreational community doesn't get this. They often go along with these plans thinking, oh, we've got another place to hunt and fish. They don't realize that they're actually getting cut out of this as well. This program, when it was first launched, it was launched very much like 30 by 30 was launched. And like I said before, you would think that maybe this is just kind of another one of those crazy ideas, and do you really take it seriously? We take it seriously because when it was first published, it was released in a publication called Bioscience. So it gave it the appearance of being having the scientific flavor. The second place that we saw it published within days, Outside Magazine, the recreational group. And then right after that, where we saw it published, was at the World Economic Forum. The international community was also pushing this. Those are 3 key indicators that this is the agenda for the West. All right, let's go to the next slide. Talked about federal lands acquisitions. Last year, the Bureau of Land Management purchased 35,000 acres in Wyoming. It's the largest federal land acquisition in that state. They did this without the knowledge of the governor or the county commissioners. We were visiting with Sid Miller yesterday, our agriculture commissioner, and one of the points we were making is this could be going on in Texas right now. Texas is so blessed that we have very little federal land. But the direct federal land acquisition is something that could be done right now in Texas, and our state officials wouldn't know about it until it was done. Next slide. From a rancher. Yes. Okay, another big one, wildlife corridors. The BLM just came out with a program where they're going to push the wildlife corridors. This is something to be looking at, especially in the private lands, because what the wildlife corridors do is they eliminate the boundaries. So one of the objectives of 30 by 30 is to create big ecosystems where species can travel without having any encumbrances at all. So the wildlife corridors is another one of those things that you'll be hearing a lot about, that they're pushing to create corridors for wildlife. And these are going in on private property as well. Next slide. And this is the one that I really want to talk a little bit more about today because I think it's going to apply to more people here, which is the conservation programs. I've kind of touched on it a little bit. But there is a publication that we've been watching and tracking. It's the House Committee. So in the House and the Senate, the Democrats had set up a select committee on the climate crisis. And in the House side, they have produced a report in 2020, which outlined all the policy changes that needed to happen in order to implement the climate crisis agenda. Included in that is a big section on what they need to do to implement 30 by 30. And one of the things in that report is that the conservation programs that landowners already trust and use, that the system's already set up for, like Conservation Reserve Program, EQIP, the Agriculture Conservation Easement, all of these programs, which ranchers are very comfortable with and familiar with, the language for these and the purpose for these needs to change. So that's in that House Select Committee report, so we've been watching for that. When the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by Congress in August of 2022, so last August, it included $20 billion added to the conservation programs, these programs that we just talked about. But they changed the language and the purpose for those programs. Next slide. One more. There we go. Okay, this is an example of what they did to EQIP. The EQIP language that's been in the 2018 Farm Bill that goes all the way back to the Food Safety Act of 1985. This program was created to help ranchers and farmers put in improvements on their land. So when you look at the purpose, the original purpose for these programs, you'll see that it's for soil conservation, for water development, improving agriculture production, improving conservation. The new language that they inserted into this is for mitigating the climate crisis, mitigating climate change, controlling livestock emissions. Remember, they're very concerned about livestock methane, so the burps and the gas from livestock, and for controlling agriculture production. This is a significant change. Programs that landowners trust, and when you go and you re-enroll in it, you don't often go back and re-research it and look at if the language is the same. Most landowners don't know that this has happened. It's something you need to be very careful about and cautious about when you start looking at signing up for these programs. Now, this language applies to the $20 billion additional funds that were put into the conservation programs in 2022. I don't know that if anybody signs these contracts that you're going to know the difference, what applies and what doesn't. I don't know that landowners are being told that. But one of our biggest concerns right now, which all of you guys can help us with, is that this is going to be the language they're going to try and get in the 2023 Farm Bill, which they're negotiating right now. This is one of those things you want to contact Farm Bureau, you want to contact your cattlemen's associations. They have big lobbying teams. Make them aware of it and make sure that they are on top of this. Why is this important? Why have they been, since 2021, since this was implemented, we've seen some key things happen through the Department of Agriculture in particular with these conservation programs. First, they started throwing a lot of money into the programs. There was a big push to get more people enrolled, more landowners enrolled. There was an increase in dollars per acre that they were giving to these conservation programs. There was an increase in the types of lands that would qualify. Big push to get landowners into these programs. Why? Well, there's already laws in existence. They don't need to be authorized. They're already on the books. They've been there for a long time. That when there's federal funding attached to private land, it creates a federal nexus. And it allows the government to restrict that land in ways that landowners don't even understand. Let me give you a specific example. The Endangered Species Act. When they designate critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act, that does not apply to private land. Okay, that's good. We like that. Unless, and what the Endangered Species Act says, unless there's any federal funding, programs, or approvals attached to that land. So let me also tell you that New Mexico cattle growers organized a call on the lesser prairie chicken for its members and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the new listing that they have made on the lesser prairie chicken to ask some of these questions. And so they had several of Fish and Wildlife Service personnel on that call. And as the ranchers were asking the questions, one of the questions I asked was if a landowner has an EQIP contract on their land. And you know, with the EQIP contract, there's a contract period. You put the improvement in, but then some of those contracts go another 20 years where you have to maintain it. So that's still in effect. If a landowner has an EQIP contract on their land, does that create the federal nexus? And he said yes. That's why they're really pushing the conservation programs. That's why the people behind the 30 by 30 agenda are pushing the conservation programs. Because that's how they can get their federal tentacles into our private land. Next. We might have a problem in the slides. Can you go one more? Yeah, it's rotating through the same slides. Okay, go back one. Thank you. Okay, so now let's pull back a little bit and look at how this program is being implemented worldwide. If you guys have been tracking what's going on in the Netherlands, and I hope you are, this is pretty critical. In the Netherlands, there have been big protests. The farmers and ranchers have been organizing protests for the last year, actually longer than that. Several years ago, the European Union began implementing 30 by 30 in Europe. The program's called, Natura 2000. And you can go to the Natura 2000 website and pull up the America the Beautiful Biden administration 30 by 30 program, and you will see the language is exactly the same. Natura 2000 promises that this program is for the purpose of helping working landowners and farmers do more with their land. Well, what's happened, you'll see that is the map of the Netherlands, or the Dutch area, the Natura 2000 covers. Those are the restricted areas now. They only give countries a certain number of nitrogen credits. And what they found in the Netherlands is that ranchers and farmers use up all those credits. So they need to eliminate the ranchers and farmers so that they can put in the renewable energy. They want to put in solar and they want to put in wind. They can't do it if the farmers and ranchers are using up all those credits. So last November, the Dutch government's Nature of Nitrogen minister issued a report, basically her ruling. And she is asking for 2,000 to 3,000 farmers and ranchers to voluntarily sell their land to the government so that they can get those credits. And if enough don't come forward by August of this year, she says, if this does not work, then we must, with pain in our hearts, enter into a discussion with a targeted group in which mandatory instruments will be used if necessary. So basically, they are being asked to voluntarily give up their property rights, leave their lands that many of these families have been on for generations, much longer than Americans, in order to comply with the equivalent of 30 by 30 in the European Union. Next slide. And most recently, the International 30 by 30 Agreement was signed and adopted by the United Nations in Montreal in December. Now, they've been working on this for some time. They've wanted to get it all formalized on what they're pursuing. What's really interesting about this document, go ahead and next slide. There's some key things that this document does that we've never really seen. We've always known was kind of the underlying purpose for a lot of their activities, but this is the first time they've really been very open about what they're pushing. The first thing that you will notice when you read through this document is it advances the worship of Mother Earth. That is the green religion. It's different than what I practice. I was taught, you read the Bible, and you worship the Creator, not the creation. They're the opposite. They worship the creation. And so you will see through this document many times about protecting Mother Earth. And in fact, that's the only religion that is specifically identified as a religion to be respected in this document. The second thing is that they say nature shall have equal rights to humans. Third thing is, of course, this is a crisis. Therefore, we can't take our time to work out solutions. We have to implement it now. We have to have transformative action now, which means eliminating people's property rights and creating, putting all this power into a collectivist system of elites who get to decide what we will do with our land. And fourth, they're calling for a $200 billion investment to implement this. There are a lot of nations and a lot of corporations that are trying to look very green. They're signing up to pay this bill. And what all this does is make it easier for them to implement this worldwide. You know, we're a target here in America, but the third world countries that really have no way to defend themselves, they're very vulnerable. I think one of the passages out of the Bible that is pretty poignant for this point in our nation right now is an oracle that God delivered to Jerusalem, which says, "And I sought for a man among them who should build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none." To me, that's one of the saddest passages in the Bible. And it's one of the reasons we fight like we do, because we live in the greatest nation ever founded. It was founded by we the people. It was founded on the principle that the people would own the land. Our opponents know that. It was Karl Marx who defined socialism as the abolishment of private property. We have to take a stand on this. We have to stop it at 30 by 30, so it doesn't get to 30 by 30, and so that we never have to deal with the 50 by 50. But this is so important. This is important not just to the beef industry, but it's important to future generations, and whether or not we leave future generations the ability to protect their individual liberties like we have today. So thank you. Sorry to deliver all the bad news, but I certainly invite you guys to help us in every way you possibly can to fight this. There's a lot you can do at home and in your community. Number one, being very, very discerning about the conservation programs and any of these kind of programs that you get into. Be very discerning about them before you sign up. The second thing is research the organizations you support. There's a really good website to go to if you are supporting any of the recreational groups in particular. It's called Hunt Fish 30 by 30. And on that website, it gives a statement by the recreational community supporting 30 by 30. There's no mention of property rights. Their philosophy is as long as they get to access the land, they're fine if it's locked up. A couple surprises for you on that list. National Rifle Association is on that list as supporting 30 by 30. Educate your local officials. That's how we got all those resolutions going, was the grassroots. Made sure their commissioners knew about it, their state officials and their federal officials. And number 3, get signed up with our literature. We put a publication, Liberty Matters, out every couple weeks. And the purpose of that is to keep you educated on these issues, and also when something is going on in Congress and we need your help to make a phone call to your representative, we can alert you and you can help us get that done. So certainly invite you to sign up for that. It's free. And I didn't bring him up here, but you guys have the guide in front of you, the 30 by 30 guide, which will give you a lot of the background that I talked about. Also brought a couple pieces. One addresses the conservation program language change that I talked about, that shows you the side-by-side comparison of the language. I got a few of those sheets that if you're interested, you can take. And then also a piece on conservation easements, if you want to learn more about them. And it's the 13 questions that landowners should ask that the land trusts don't tell you about conservation easements, that you're welcome to pick up, and hopefully that'll help you get better educated. So thank you, Bruce, for the invite, and thank you all for your attention. Well, we can take questions, and I'm sorry, sir, I didn't, any questions that you guys have, I'll be happy to answer them. Yeah, no, it was a willing seller. It definitely was a willing seller. But here's something that is, and I know that's kind of a tricky situation, because you're thinking, well, but the landowner has the right to sell that land. But there's a couple things that happened first when 30 by 30 was initiated. Number one, in the Trump administration, there was a policy in Department of Interior that before the federal government purchased any land in any community, they had to get approval from the local government and the state. That was so that the people would be informed about it. Now, why is that important? Because when land goes from private property to government ownership, it goes off the tax roll. The government doesn't pay taxes. So communities with a lot of federal land have a very hard time funding very basic services like road maintenance, schools, fire districts, emergency services, hospitals. It really drains them. Now, the government says we will pay what's called PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. And it's a fee that they pay they have a formula that they use to pay these communities based on how much federal land is in that community. But you know that's never fully funded. County commissioners in the West go back to DC, hat in hand, and beg for that funding every year. So PILT, in many respects, is certainly not any kind of a guarantee. So because of that, the Trump administration thought the local communities should have a say in this if they want federal lands, if they want to take those lands off the tax roll. That's, interestingly, I didn't mention that in this presentation, but 13 days after they initiated 30 by 30, the acting secretary of the Department of Interior eliminated that rule. So they removed a big hurdle for them to take and purchase private property. And I really think that that's the kind of a situation where the people should have a say. The county commissioners, our elected representatives, should have a say because it changes the dynamics. It's not like selling land, which I think is private, between you and me. We're talking about selling land to a government entity that has the power to control and regulate the people. But we, the people, are supposed to have the power. So shouldn't we have a say in how much land the federal government acquires? There should at least be transparency in that. Fortunately, Governor Gordon in Wyoming has pushed that, and so they now are going through a public review on that purchase. So maybe they may be able to stop it. But without that, we're kind of stuck. Any other questions?
in this whole federal tax on this?
Well, it's not a matter if they're willingly participating or not. Once it gets in, so a conservation easement is approved, it's a federal contract. The states write it, but to get the tax deduction or the estate deduction, that comes from the IRS. That's IRS approved. So the federal government has a hand in the conservation easements, the whole process. It's Congress who authorized these. And so yes, they have a hand in it. It doesn't come down to whether or not the land trusts agree to participate or not. That's not even a decision. Because of the whole process of a conservation easement and that federal approval of them, that's what puts them into that permanently protected. The federal government knows they can enforce that.